This reading was brought to you by the Ministry of Image. With a focus on high-quality hardcover prints, the Ministry of Image brings your favorite fan fictions to your doorstep. They have provided me with a hardcover copy of the book Tales of the Sun to read to you all, and then give away at the end. To hear more about them and the upcoming giveaway, stay tuned to the end of the reading. Tales of the Sun, Celestia 17, written by Broken Image 321. Memory, the day I grew up. The princess is dead. I sniffled. The mare lying in the box wasn't Mommy. She looked like her, but she was weird and cold and dried up somehow. I stood next to the box, trying not to shake. Everyone in the world was watching me. I just wanted to be back in my bed. I wanted to cry, but princesses don't cry. Princesses had to be brave. And so there I stood, watching not Mommy, lying in her box, and trying not to think about what was going to happen next. A stallion, wearing a fancy robe, stepped up next to the box. He lit his horn and pulled at the pin holding together Mommy's collar, wide and flat and gold and covered in jewels. I almost screamed at him, "That's Mommy's! Don't touch that!" But I knew he had to, so I said nothing. The collar came free, and with a sound like tinkling wind chimes or falling rain, Mommy's wings fell apart. White feathers dropped like flower petals from her wings, which grew smaller and shrank back into her, and soon all that was left were a couple of pink scars where her wings had been, and Mommy was just a unicorn again, just like me. The stallion in the suit turned to me. He smiled, then, with his magic, pushed the collar towards me. I tried not to cry. They'd told me what would happen next. They'd made me eat eggs and drink milk for the past week. Said I'd need it. Said I'd be grateful. I wanted to say no. Don't. I don't want it. That's Mommy's. And Mommy's going to get better. You'll see. But I didn't. The cold metal closed around my neck and snapped shut behind me. The gold pin slid into place, and instantly I felt a burning just over my shoulder blades. I gritted my teeth. I didn't want this. I wanted to be home with Mommy. I wanted to scream and rip the collar off. Before I could move, my eyes widened and I howled. My shoulders split open, the bones cracking and realigning. I bit my lip and trembled as my wings began to grow, the bones long and spindly, the skin just barely covering, the muscles swelling and hardening, the feathers growing in like jagged, broken glass. I bit my lip until my mouth tasted like pennies. The tears ran freely down my face. Long live the princess. The stallion in the robe called, "Long live Celestia, the 17th, 63rd Princess of the Sun." And the audience began to cheer. I looked up and saw them, watching me, their new 12-year-old princess. They thought I was so great, so pretty there with my new wings. But they didn't know. They didn't know how much my wings hurt and how my heart hurt even more. They didn't know that I had no idea what to do. They didn't know how all I wanted was to be left alone and to be able to cry for Mommy. They just cheered over and over, excited to see me, excited for all the things they wanted me to do, the things that I had no idea how to even begin. And so I ran. I turned and galloped off stage. Despite the cries of the stallion in the robe, I dodged the guards and ducked through an open doorway into a side hallway. I ran towards the one place I knew there was a friend who would help me. And there she was, in a little alcove just off the library. I fell into her arms and I sobbed. "It's okay, Cece," Twilight Sparkle said. "It's okay. It's all going to be okay." Opus 46, Morning Mood. I slammed a hoof against my alarm clock. I groaned, sat up, buried my face in my hooves. I'd been doing this for 5 years, but 5 o'clock was still too damn early in the morning. I sat that way for several minutes, then peeled back my covers and stumbled out of bed. I lit my horn, then groggily made my way to the glass case over the mantel. I opened it without looking and fished out the petrol inside, the wide, low-slung collar with the magic stone in it, then slipped it around my neck, pressed the two ends together behind me, and dropped the small golden pin into the latch behind my back. As soon as I heard the click and the pin sliding home, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end and a little shiver of magic ran up my wings and out to the tips of my feathers. My wings. 5 years later, and I still wasn't entirely used to them. They were heavy and hot and itchy and, more often than not, just got in the way. Plus, after the initial rush, flying wasn't everything it was cracked up to be. I'd rather take the train, truth be told. But love 'em or hate 'em, wings and horns came with the petrol. As long as I was princess, I'd have to learn to deal with the darn things. I glanced at my alarm clock, the numbers glowing green in the darkness. 5:13. Damn it. Sunrise was at 5:30. It was always at 5:30. But then again, I wasn't in the mood to wait. An extra 15 minutes of sunshine wouldn't hurt anyone. I stumbled out onto the balcony, overlooking the palace courtyard, and beyond it, the Canterlot Valley below. The stars were still out, and the crickets were chirping. I lit my horn and felt the stone against my chest grow warmer. And soon, the horizon began to grow rosy pink. As soon as the first sliver of sun peeked up over the horizon, I doused my horn, then reached back and ripped out the pin holding the petrol together. Instantly, the stone turned cold, but before I could feel it, I'd already pried the whole thing off my neck and walked back into my room. As I passed the case on the mantel, I tossed the petrol back into its case with an echoing crash of metal. Philomena, dozing on her perch, squawked irritably at me as I made my way towards the bathroom. I stood in the shower, water running through my already sodden mane and down my legs until the water started to go cold. I half-heartedly blow-dried and brushed out my mane and tail, flapped my wings to air-dry my feathers a little, and then finished by snapping a scrunchie into my mane. I plodded to my closet, then grabbed my hoodie from where it lay on a heap on the floor. It was dark blue with CHS Senior Band printed in gold across the chest. I pulled it on and yawned, smacked my lips once or twice, then turned and gazed stupidly around my room. By now, the sun was up, bathing everything in rosy orange light. There in the corner by the balcony stood my ratty old armchair and matching ottoman, covered in loose homework and empty chip bags. Just at the foot of the chair stood my fireplace, a lifesaver in the wintertime, still romantic in the summertime, and useful for sending messages all the way around. The mantel was crowded with little mementos, a cheap plastic snow globe from Manhattan, a framed picture of me and Twy when we were little, and in the middle. I swallowed, then stepped closer. In the center of the mantel, below a dramatic, full-size portrait of Princess Helia, lay a long, low glass case, currently hanging open, and inside on a cushion of velvet lay my royal regalia, my horseshoes, my crown, and of course, the Big Mama, the Petrol Aurum, the true badge of my office. The petrol was wide, a low-slung collar made of gold, designed like some ancient piece of armor, engraved and decorated until it looked more like a piece of art than anything you could easily wear. It was set with a number of hefty gems, but with the biggest stone by far was almost invisible save for a peek through a small diamond-shaped window in the front of the collar. The Sunstone, a wide, flat, 8-sided purple gem. It was mounted on the back side of the petrol, placed so it would press against my chest when I put the thing on. And truth be told, the petrol was still a little big on me, but that wasn't the important bit. After all, the local jewelers can't exactly resize a magical artifact on demand. I would grow into it, eventually. That was part of the magic. No, the most important part of the whole thing was the Sunstone itself. Not only was it a priceless gem on its own, but it was, What gave me the magical power to raise the sun every day? No biggie. The Patrol, the single most important thing I owned, literal priceless artifact and the reason for my existence, currently lay upside down in a tangle of ornate horseshoes in the corner of the case where I'd thrown it. With my crown laying haphazardly on top, looking at it, I felt a little twinge of guilt, but I quickly brushed it off. The maids would straighten it up. They always did. I sighed, then turned back to my room. Opposite the fireplace stood my old 4-poster bed. Still a mess, of course, with pillows and stuffed animals scattered everywhere. Philomena, my pet phoenix, stood on her perch just beside the bed, dozing. She looked up at me, tweeted sleepily, then put her head back under her wing. Leaning against the base of her perch were my school bags, the flaps hanging open, papers spilling everywhere. Next to it stood my trumpet case, CHS band printed on the side. A pile of sheet music sitting on top, and above it hung a crooked black and white poster of Joust Hoofstrong, his trumpet pressed to his lips as gently as if he was kissing a pretty mare. I smiled a little, then looked away. Beside the bed stood my nightstand, bearing a messy stack of blank parchment, a few gnawed quills, and a half-empty bottle of ink, and there beside the lamp on my nightstand stood my alarm clock, the display currently reading 6:52. I stared. 6:52. Another breathless moment, and then I swore, turned, and scrambled to the door. 2 minutes later, I stumbled into the palace kitchens. It was always rather hectic in here, but ponies knew to give me wide berth, at least in the mornings. They already had my pancake mix laid out next to several dishes of sliced fruit in an empty griddle. But I didn't have time for pancakes today. Instead, I grabbed a spare bowl off a passing china cart, filled it with golden hooves from a box in the pantry, and sloshed some milk over it from one of the open jugs in the walk-in fridge. On my way out, I shoved a spoon and a can of Mountie Dew in my pocket of my hoodie. I hurried from the kitchen to the breakfast salon, pushed open the door, then hesitated. The clock on the opposite wall read 7:01. 2 of the seats at the circular table were already full, leaving the one in the far corner for me. I rolled my eyes, then sidled along one wall, and as I passed behind one of the chairs, I accidentally nudged it with my hip, and its occupant, my older brother Blue Blood, turned and shot me a glare. "Sunbutt," he said by way of greeting. "Blue balls," I shot back as I squeezed past him. "Now, children," said a voice. "There is no call for that sort of language, especially at the breakfast table." I pulled my seat up and flopped down onto it just as Blue Blood bowed. "Of course. My apologies." I just shoved a spoonful of cereal in my mouth, not daring to look up. Blue Blood smirked at me, then turned back to his coffee. He had 2 years on me, and had apparently spent most of that extra time inventing new ways to torture his future sister. He'd graduated from school a while ago, and I kept on half expecting him to go and try to make something of himself. He's gotten his cutie mark in astronomy, after all, but it seemed he was never really going to leave the nest. His new life goal, as far as I could tell, was to be a gold medalist in the debauchery Olympics, and he'd been making a good try for it, at least. But then again, he'd been born a colt. It wasn't him who'd have to— "Your Highness," said a voice. "No pancakes this morning?" An observation, not a question. "She must have been up late again," Blue Blood volunteered. "Writing Twilight?" "Doubtless." I snarled. I had been writing Twilight, but that wasn't the point. "I couldn't sleep," I said aloud. "Even so," said the voice, "that is no excuse for failing to take adequate care of oneself." I almost shot back that I'd had a nightmare. But then I remembered who I was speaking to. I was in a bad mood, but I wasn't crazy. Instead, I cracked open my soda, put the can to my lips, tilted my head back, and took a long pull. And as I set the can down, I locked eyes with the owner of the voice, the other occupant of the table. "Great Aunt Luna," I said evenly. Aunt Looney sat at the third seat of the table, already wearing one of her old-fashioned dresses, with long sleeves and a high lacy collar. She was tall and lean, wrinkled, almost withered sometimes, but she had an inner fire that anyone who crossed her, including myself, was all too familiar with. She wore her blue steel mane in a tight bun and a tiny pair of Prince Nez glasses. Honestly, with her millennium-old fashions and equally strict manners, sometimes she looked like she'd stepped straight out of a history book. And truth be told, most of the time I wished that was where she'd stayed. But despite my wishing, she was a princess. Though I couldn't see it, I could tell it was there. Under her dress, across her chest, lay her own ceremonial collar. Thought lost for a millennium. A wide, black iron band set with a clear-cut crystal. The Patral Ferrum, the badge of her princesshood. She was never without it. Sometimes, I suspected she even slept in the thing. Looney watched me for a moment longer, then turned back to her breakfast. I knew what she was having without even looking at it. A single cup of hot chocolate, thick and old-fashioned, 1 crumpet, lightly toasted, 1 pat of butter, warmed, 1 small pot of orange marmalade, cool but not cold, 1 butter knife, placed in the upper left corner of the plate at a 35-degree angle, a tiny spoon placed beside the marmalade for serving, all prepared, ready, and in place at 7 a.m. sharp. I looked down and shoved another spoonful of cereal in my mouth. I heard Luna light her horn, and a moment later, she tapped the marmalade spoon on the edge of the pot, which rang out with a high-pitched ting-ting. "Princess Celestia," she said, almost casually. I looked up. That was her "I expect a response" tone. I swallowed my cereal. "Cece," I corrected her. "Unless there has been a recent development," she said, her eyes on the knife she was using to spread marmalade. "Your mother named you Celestia, not Cece." She enunciated the nickname, disdain dripping from every word. I scowled. "In any case," she continued, "after orchestra, there will be a short dedication ceremony at the new Starflower Memorial Elementary. It would be most gracious of you to attend." Most gracious. Coming from her, that was an order. "Actually," I said, "I already have plans for after band," I added. Looney glanced up at me over her glasses. "Really?" she said, a hint of disapproval in her voice. "Pray tell." "I've scheduled a public service opportunity," I improvised, "helping the less fortunate, you know." Don't ask what. "If I may ask," she said. "Doing what?" Damn it. I sighed, helping an old family maintain a historical site. Looney raised an eyebrow, then gave a little approving half nod. I started to smile. "Meaning," Blueblood interjected, "she wants to help the apples down on the farm." I whirled on Blueblood. "Who told you that?" I snarled. "You did," he said, "just now." He grinned at me, somehow maintaining the grin even as he took a sip of coffee. I scowled at him, then turned back to look at Luna, who was already glowering at me over the top of her glasses. I smiled sheepishly. "Well," I said, "I really wouldn't put it that way." Looney set down both knife and crumpet. "Your Highness, though surely you find it amusing to gallivant off like this, you are a princess, you have duties, and playing in the dirt is not one of them." "But why can't Blueblood do it?" I said, letting a little whine into my voice. "This is really important, and Blueblood is exempt," Looney interrupted, "because Blueblood is not a princess, and besides," she said, her voice dropping into a growl, "what exactly about spending time with your friends is so important that it simply cannot wait?" I sat up a little taller. I promised I would. I said, and I keep my promises. Besides, they need help. Applejack has been trying to harvest the whole orchard by herself, Twilight said there. Luna's eyes flashed. "So that is who this is about, is it?" I shrank back in my chair. Looney leaned forward a little. "Believe me when I say," she said carefully, "that I have no malice towards my granddaughter. And building good relations with the future Moon Princess is an admirable pursuit. However," she added, "despite what you may think, your private social obligations do not trump your royal duties, and your continual habit of shirking your responsibilities must stop at once, especially if doing so involves physical labor, such as not, she sniffed, proper. I scowled. Proper. That one word ended the discussion. Looney was obsessed with proper. That was about the only thing she ever talked about, at least to me. Looney picked up her marmalade knife again. So, I shall expect you to visit Starflower Memorial after you have finished your orchestra. Some royal presence is needed there, I think, and I have previous obligations of my own I must attend to. She glanced up at me. Can I count on you being there? I looked up at her, my eyes smoldering. Yes, Aunt Luna. I lied.
Memory. The day we met. I huffed and folded my arms. I was 9 years old. I didn't need to be babysat like this. I sat at the desk in the small white room, my math workbook on the desk in front of me. I'd never been in this room before, but Mrs. Gumdrop said I had to. Said my grades weren't good. She actually said needs improvement, but I knew what that meant. She said that I'd got some special help, some pony who was going to fix me. She'd said 2 tore. Sounded dumb to me, and I didn't need to be fixed. I was fine. But Principal Fairweather had pulled me out of class, made it sound like it was something good and special happening, but we all knew that I was in trouble. And Minnie and Lem and Twink, they'd all watched me go as I blushed in embarrassment. I looked down at my workbook and flipped it open. Mrs. Gumdrop had made a lot of angry red marks. I scowled. I hated math, almost as much as I hated waiting. But I was a princess. Or I was going to be anyways. I didn't need math. I'd have ponies to do it for me. And besides... The door clicked open and I looked up. Just in here, Twilight. Principal Fairweather was saying, Lady Celestia is waiting patiently for you. In walked a little purple filly. She looked really young, almost a baby. She had her mane in a bun and wore thick glasses with black frames. She looked up at me and froze. I narrowed my eyes. Who are you? I demanded. She swallowed. Twilight Sparkle, my lady, she stammered. And what are you doing here? I'm your... My eyes widened. You're my tutor? I gasped. But you're a baby. Are you even done with magic kindergarten yet? The filly, Twilight, shrank back and made a little noise. I scoffed. I don't need help. I said I don't need math, and I don't need you. Go back to kindergarten and eat paste or something. Twilight sniffed and turned away, but Principal Fairweather was standing right behind her. Lady Celestia, he said carefully. That wasn't appropriate. Could you apologize to Twilight, please? I smirked. No, I said. Fairweather opened his mouth, then closed it again. I smiled at him. I knew he couldn't do anything to me. Mommy was princess, and this was the Royal Academy for Gifted Unicorns, which meant that she was his boss. Even if he wanted to, what could he do? Knowing it'd get back to her. It's okay, Principal Fairweather, Twilight mumbled, her voice thick. I'll just go back. She turned away. Fairweather shot me a disappointed look, but I just smiled at him. I was going to say something snarky to Twilight, but when I looked at her, my eyes widened. Hey, I said. Are those Philly second handbags? Twilight looked back at me and sniffled. Yeah, she said. Mama got them for me at the hoof wheel. Do you... I swallowed. Do you actually read Power Ponies? She hesitated. Sometimes. I shifted uncomfortably. Who's your favorite? I asked. She eyed me carefully. Matterhorn, she said carefully. Really? I asked. Matterhorn? I think she's pretty, she said defensively. Yeah, but Marvelous is so much cooler. Twilight crept up to me and clambered up on the chair beside me. I didn't know any other fillies like them. I shrugged. I got my brother's hand-me-downs. Me too, Twilight squeaked eagerly, then clamped her hooves over her mouth. I rolled my eyes. You have the newest issue? I asked. She opened her bags and fished out a folded and dog-eared comic book. She passed it to me, and I snatched it up. I don't remember this one, I said, turning it over. Shiny says it's a varmint. I looked at her questioningly. She blushed and looked down. Variant, something like that, she muttered. I flipped it open and made an appreciative little noise. I read silently for a few moments, then turned the page. Twilight looked up at me hesitantly, then reached over and grabbed my workbook. She pulled it close, flipped it open, and began to read carefully. A few minutes later, right as Zap was about to buck Captain Kolick in the face, Twilight tapped me on the shoulder. I turned and looked at her, and she shrank back a little. Lady, she said, I think I figured out where you're going wrong. I almost snapped at her to let me finish, but then I saw her look. She was frightened, yes, but also hopeful, and trusting, and odd. She was afraid of me, but at the same time she looked up to me and wanted to impress me. I'd had lots of ponies try to suck up to me. I had 20 or 30 who I could milk for free candy bars or lunch money, or who would even do my homework for me if I made them. But there was something earnest and sincere in Twilight's look, something I wasn't sure I'd seen before. And at that moment, I made a decision. Please, I said, closing the comic. Call me Cece. I leaned in a little closer. And now, show me. Canterlot High School Fight Song. Go Apes! I pushed open the front doors of the school and strode out into the golden sunshine. I smiled and nodded at the 1 or 2 ponies who called my name, but still made a beeline for the statue on the front lawn, a golden gorilla standing on a square block of marble, which the school had affectionately named Howie. I flopped down beside it, dropped my trumpet case and saddlebags, and dug out my lunch. I took a thoughtful bite. It was only the first day of classes. I hoped that the others remembered our spot. I was halfway through my sandwich when I heard hooves clip-clopping toward me. Ah, Mr. Tenderhoof, I said grandly without looking up. So glad you could make it. Ugh, Trendy replied. Brown bag lunch again? I would have thought you were better than that, Your Highness. I looked up and grinned. Best damn brown paper in Equestria, I said, made from rainforest wood and spotted owl feathers. 1,000 bits a sheet. Good to hear our tax money is being spent well then, Trendy said as he sat down beside me, setting his blue plastic cafeteria tray in his lap. I leaned over and gave him a quick side hug. Minuet plopped down on my other side and wasted no time digging into my lunch for the carrot stick she knew I'd packed for her. Lemon Hearts, close behind her, plunked herself down on the other side of Trendy, took his arm in hers, and leaned her head on his shoulder. Twinkleshine scrambled up onto Howie himself over the no climbing sign before settling in. I grinned, just like old times, except I glanced over at Trendy and Lem. So you're official now? I asked. Lem sighed happily. Since June, she said dreamily. Huh, I said, big summer, then? Twink above me scoffed. You're one to talk, she said. Yeah, Minnie added, with that summer sun celebration and all, fighting nightmare. Before she could get the word out, I hauled back and slugged her. Ow, she yelped, rubbing at her shoulder. What'd you have to do that for? Sorry, I muttered. Habit. She's sensitive. Everyone was quiet for a moment. I hesitated, then took another bite of my sandwich. Have clefif? I asked through my peanut butter and marshmallows. Twink groaned. History test tomorrow, she moaned. First day of school and they're already laying it on. Len gave me a sidelong glance. Mr. Letterpress says it's only pre-test, she said. Nothing to worry about. Still, Twink cried, it isn't fair. What right do they have to test us on stuff after we've had all summer off, before we've even learned it? Minnie chuckled and I grinned. These four, at least, hadn't changed in the slightest. With everything else that was going on, that was comforting. Lem leaned forward. So, Cece? She asked, you heard from Twy recently? I looked sharply over at her, then slowly swallowed my bite of sandwich. Yeah, I admitted. If Len heard something in my voice, she didn't show it. How's she doing? She asked. Been a while since we've heard from her. She's doing fine, I said. Just school. Friends. You know. Twink rolled her eyes. Sure, she muttered. Her Ponyville friends. She didn't even say goodbye. Keeping up with other ponies when you move away is hard. Minnie cut in. You try it sometime. Twink just huffed and leaned back against Howie. Lem squeezed Trendy's arm and smiled up at Twink. If you want, she said, you could come with us next time we're down there. Lyra said she found a nice place of her own, and it'd be fun to visit. And we all could drop in on Twy. Now that the attention was safely off me, I took another bite of sandwich, then practically choked when Trendy patted me on the shoulder. So, how you doing, Cece? He asked. Holding up? I coughed once or twice, spraying crumbs, and swallowed. Fine, I gasped. Uh-huh, he prompted. Go on. I hesitated. Band is all right, I said. Practice has been going a little long. We've got the back-to-school pep rally coming up, so I know that. Trendy snapped. Band is band, same ol', same ol'. But how are you doing, Celestia? He asked. You were closest to Twy, after all, and you haven't had us over to your place in forever. He chuckled. I mean, the palace is a little stuffy sometimes, but still. I swallowed again, my mouth suddenly dry. I didn't know what exactly he was asking, but I knew for sure I didn't want to answer him. Here, I was among friends, old friends, but school friends. These were the sort of ponies who you could go out for donuts with, but not the sort who would let you cry on their shoulder, not the sort who you could bare your soul onto, not the sort who would reassure you at 2 a.m, by letter if they couldn't be there themselves, that things would be all right in the end, that somehow, though it all looks hopeless now, things would end up working out, eventually. Not the sort of friends who would travel the literal gates of Tartarus and back for you, if you asked, and not the sort who would do the same for if you were honest with yourself. In short, they were good ponies, and I liked spending time with them. But there was no way I could answer Trendy's questions honestly, not in a million years. Well, I began. Twink didn't even wait for the yard duty to call her name. She scrambled right off the statue onto Trendy's head, spilling her lunch on me and Lem in the process. Lem shrieked in surprise, and Trendy yelped. Me? I took advantage of the distraction to shove the rest of my sandwich in my mouth. No way I could answer questions now. And while Lem was brushing cracker crumbs off herself, I dabbed at my eyes with the back of my hoof. Just in case, couldn't let them know I had anything to cry about, after all. Not these ponies. Tears could wait. Memory. The day I noticed. I think that's enough math for today, Twilight said. What would you like to work on next, Cease? I heaved a sigh. We'd been working for an hour and a half and my brain already felt like oatmeal. I glanced over at Twy and blanked. For the following questions, Princess Celestia C is 13 years old. Twilight Sparkle T is 11. If C received her wings 1 year ago, how much longer until she gets used to them? 2. If the difference between blue bloods, B and C's age is the same as between C's and T's ages, how many more years until B becomes something other than a useless lump? 3. If Whirligig boards a train leaving Canterlot traveling C miles per hour at T o'clock and... I shook my head. Anything else? I croaked, dropping my head to my desk. Twilight smiled weakly. She thought for a moment, then dug in her bag. As she rooted around, I turned to look at her and smiled. I was gonna miss her, at least for a little bit. My birthday was next month. I was gonna be 14, which meant that, after this year, I was going to have to leave the Royal Academy and go to a high school. Aunt Velvet was trying to convince me to go to a private school, but I didn't really want to. Lyra was already at CHS, and she said it was nice. Even so, I was a little sad. It meant that I'd have to leave Twilight behind, at least for a little while. But hey, she'd make school friends of her own, wouldn't she? I mean, she'd have to. Twilight dropped a heavy textbook on the table, and I jumped. "How about this?" she said. I sat up a little and looked at the cover. It had a stack of old scrolls on the front, flanked by a stylized sun and moon. She hesitated, then giggled a bit. "I was wondering if you could help me with history." I sat up. History was one of the few things I was good at. Probably had something to do with the fact that I grew up hearing the legends over the breakfast table every morning. "What topic?" I asked. She giggled nervously. The secession crisis," she admitted. "I can never get the names right." I raised an eyebrow. Hadn't we gone over this before? "Okay, well, the names are easier if you remember the story, so let's start there." Twilight nodded and got out her spiral-bound notebook, and she flipped to a blank page. I started talking. "So," I began, "like 1,000 years ago, there was no princesses. There was only the one ruler, and she was a queen, the cosmic queen, and the one we called Celestia." Twilight looked up. "Like you?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, she was Celestia the First, but she was a queen, not a princess." I coughed a little. "There's a lot of Celestias, don't get confused." Twilight made a note in her book. "Anyway," I said, "the Cosmic Queen was supposed to move both the sun and the moon at the same time, and she used the Cosmic Stone to do it." "Which was both the sun and moonstone at once?" Twilight interjected. "More or less." "So, Queen Celestia had a set of twin daughters, Solus and Luna. They were both equally good and smart, and Queen Celestia couldn't decide who should get the Cosmic Stone." "Shouldn't it have been the oldest twin?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it was a C-section or something. Anyways, she couldn't decide, so she split it. Solus got the Sunstone, and Luna got the Moonstone." "But now there's only one," Twilight interrupted, "the Sunstone." "Basically," I said. "Okay, so Princess Solus and Princess Luna had to work together to move the sun and moon, each using their own stone. And things worked well, until Solus died." I peered down at Twilight's notes. "You getting all this?" I asked. Twilight made a few hurried notes, then nodded. "Anyways, Solus died, and it was the time to decide who should get the Sunstone. Solus willed the stone to her daughter, Helia. And she's the one who built Canterlot, right?" I nodded. "First act as princess. So, Helia ended up with the stone, even though Princess Luna thought it should go to her daughter Selene, who was 3 years older." Twilight jotted something down, then added, "So then she..." I nodded. "Princess Luna became super jealous of Helia, so she turned into a monster called Nightmare Moon, who wanted to make sure the sun never rose again. So Princess Helia had to use the Sunstone, plus the elements of harmony." "What are those?" Twilight interrupted again. I shrugged. Musical instruments? Anyways, she had to use her stone to banish Nightmare Moon, and the Moonstone with her. Twilight nodded slowly. So now there's only one princess. I nodded. Yep. And that's you. Yep. Twilight made a little note. Queen Celestia, she muttered to herself. Solus, Luna, Helia, Selene. She glanced up. Isn't there a prophecy, too? Huh? I asked, looking at her. A prophecy, she repeated. I thought I read it somewhere. That's not history, though. Yeah, but still, she smiled awkwardly. I like old stuff like that. I sighed dramatically. Fine. Yes, there's a prophecy. Supposedly Nightmare Moon is going to come back someday, and supposedly the power of sun, moon, and stars will stop her. I added, with generous air quotes, though no one really believes that stuff. Twilight nodded and scribbled in her book. I watched her write for a second, then did a double take. I leaned closer. Yes, I was right. She had nothing written down, just a bunch of little nonsense marks and sun, moon, and stars. I looked sharply up at her, and she grinned sheepishly. I raised an eyebrow. Do I need to go over it again? She shook her head, then closed her notebook. No, she said. I got it. I eyed her suspiciously. Are you sure? She nodded. I got it, Cease. Something clicked in my brain. And you're sure you weren't just giving me a chance to show off because we'd just finished our math? Twilight shrugged, but didn't meet my eye. I like old stuff like that, she repeated, then shoved her notebook in her bag. You ready for physics? She asked. I stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Jazz Standard in C. Scrapple from the Apple. Good work there, Cece, Applejack called. Almost there. I shielded my eyes from the setting sun and saw Applejack a few rows over, waving to me. Even from this distance, she looked exhausted. But even so, she'd done easily half the work today and was still going relatively strong, all things considered. I'd been here for 3 or 4 hours, barely half of what the others had done, but I was already wishing for home, though I could probably keep going for another few hours. I'd never bucked apples before, and I was already sweaty and a little sore. But Applejack had given me a red bandana to hold my mane back, which I had to admit looked pretty good on me, and shown me how to buck like a pro. Besides, we were almost done, another 100 or so trees left, so I braced my front hooves, lifted my back legs, and bucked. The apples shook but did not fall. I huffed. I was plenty tall, and fairly strong, which is why Applejack had picked me to buck. But I was no Applejack. She had it down to a science. Twice said she could drop the apples into bushels every time, but even though I tried my best, I just couldn't do it. Instead, the others had to gather up the apples I knocked down manually. Or, at least, they did when I actually managed to knock them loose. I bucked again, and a third time before the apples started to fall. I helped and tried to shield myself with a wing. I got it, cried Twilight. Twilight leapt towards me, an empty bushel held in her magic. She caught a few of the apples, but missed most of them, and landed flat in the dirt. She looked up at me sheepishly, but I just laughed, then walked over and helped her to her hooves. Twilight, as always, wore her mane in a bun, something simple, functional, and out of the way. Her glasses, thick square frames with black rims, had been the same for as long as I'd known her. She was rather quiet, shy, and bookish, so when she'd asked me to help her with farm work, I was, to put it mildly, more than a little surprised, but all the same, I was proud of her for getting out of her shell a little. I dusted her off with one wing and gave her a hug. She looked down. Sorry, I wasn't ready. Sorry I didn't check first, I replied. Twilight flashed me a quick smile, then turned back to the fallen apples. She used her magic to pick them up in groups of 5 or 6, then set them in the bushel. I picked up one in my hoof and tossed it in, then scanned the tree. "Oh, horse apples," I muttered. Twilight looked up at me, then turned to follow my gaze, and saw up at the very top of the tree a single, bright red apple, still clinging stubbornly to the branch. She stared at it for just a moment, then lit her horn. "Nope," I cried, "don't!" But the apple glowed reddish-violet, and Twilight pulled it gently from the tree. She floated it down and set it gently on top of the ones in the bushels, then turned and shot me a crooked grin. "You're lucky AJ didn't see you," I said, hefting the bushel in my own magic and setting it on my back. "She would have had a fit." "I'm getting better," she protested. "Better than tearing a tree in half isn't much of an improvement," I replied, nudging her fondly with an elbow. Twilight chuckled nervously, then looked away. As I turned to walk back towards the wagon, she fell in step beside me. We walked in silence for a few moments. "So," I asked, "how was school? Any cute colts?" Twilight looked up at me, a blush already spreading across her cheeks, then glanced out at the horizon before looking down again. I followed her gaze, and in the distance saw the old apple farmhouse. Up on top of the hill, I stared at it for a few seconds before it clicked. "Big Mac! You thirsty little panther. Isn't he like 25? 22, she muttered. I giggled and sighed. "Good for you." I said nothing wrong with good taste. Twilight looked up at me, and a little smile spread across her face. She walked in silence for a while longer. "Hey," I said, glancing down at her. "Sorry again about those gala tickets." She shrugged. "It's okay." "No, it's not," I insisted. "I know it was a straight-up clerical error, but that's still no excuse to cause so much trouble." Twilight turned and looked at me over her glasses. "It's okay, Cease," she insisted. "We got it worked out, and even if we hadn't, October 15th is a long ways away." She smiled. "All of us are looking forward to it already, by the way." She added, "Rarity's even dreaming up dress designs for us already." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? That's awfully generous of her." Twilight shrugged. "This is sort of her thing," she said with a little smile. We reached the wagon just as Fluttershy and Pinky did. Fluttershy gently placed her bushel in the bed of the wagon, and Pinky practically threw hers on top before bounding off again. Fluttershy cried out, then zoomed after her. "Speaking of," Twilight said as she hefted her own bushel, "Rarity wanted me to ask about your measurements. She's working on a dress for you too." I stopped mid-stride. "Really?" I said, a note of fear in my voice. Twilight turned back a bit, a question in her eyes, and I looked down. She doesn't need to do that," I stammered. "Of course she doesn't," Twilight said. "But like I said, that's her thing. Plus," she added, grinning at me, "we all need to match, don't we?" I nodded, and we started to walk back to the next apple tree. As we walked, I watched Twilight out of the corner of my eye. She was dirty and sweaty, but she was glowing, smiling like an idiot, waving at Rainbow Dash and Rarity as they passed, the latter wearing oversized shades and a big floppy hat. It almost made me a little jealous, in fact, especially since it was Twilight. I mean, she was my best friend, but still, she hadn't exactly been burdened with social graces when she left Canterlot. And to see her like this, now... I swallowed. "It seems you're liking it here in Ponyville." Twilight nodded. "I am. I miss being around the palace and seeing you all the time," she added, "but Ponyville is... nice." I nodded. "I've been enjoying your letters," I said. "So, the friendship studies are going well?" "My friendships are, yes," she corrected me. "I don't like studies. Makes it sound like a job." "It sorta is," I replied. "If your ability to use the elements is dependent on your relationships, and the elements really are what legends say they are." "I know," Twilight said, cutting me off, "but I still don't like thinking that way. Feels..." She gestured vaguely. "Insincere." I picked up a couple of empty bushels from the stack by the wagon and set them on my back. then turned and started walking toward the next tree in line, still heavy with fruit. "Either way," I said, "just be glad you don't have to be around Looney all the time, I mean." "Please don't speak ill of grandmother," Twilight said quietly. I turned and stared, but Twilight just kept walking. I scanned her face, then sighed, and tried to catch up. I pulled up alongside her and we walked in silence for several seconds. "Sorry," I said. "I forgot how you feel about her." Though Twilight hadn't spoken openly about her feelings regarding her something great-grandmother, it was pretty clear to all of us that she was equal parts awed and terrified. You couldn't exactly blame her, of course, not with everything that had been sprung on the two of us over the summer. But still. And yet, Twilight hadn't been in Ponyville longer than 3 months or so, but she'd still started growing a bit of a backbone. Back in Canterlot, she'd hardly ever made such a request, even in the politest terms. But now, she'd started standing up for herself. To be honest, I was sort of proud of her. "Apology accepted," she said. "No harm done." I nodded, then set down the bushels around our next tree and eyeballed the apples above them. "Either way," I said, "if you ever feel like coming back, there's always a spare room for you at the palace." "Don't tempt me," she giggled, eyeing the placement of the bushels, then picked up an empty one in her magic. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," I replied, and I braced my forehooves. Memory. The day of nightmares. "No," I breathed. "No, you're not real." We stood in the darkened cavern of the Ponyville Town Hall. Summer sun celebration banners hanging from the ceiling, and towering over me stood a mare, coat black as midnight, her mane and tail billowing out behind her in an indigo haze, her armor glinting in the candlelight. "Lying is naughty," she purred, "and naughty fillies must be punished." Guards!" I shrieked, "help me!" The guards were already charging towards us through the crowd. Nightmare Moon lit her horn and tossed her head, and they slammed against the wall and fell to the floor. She never even broke eye contact with me. "The Sunstone," she snarled. "Give it to me." I clenched reflexively at my petrol. "No!" I cried, my voice small and weak in the darkness. Nightmare Moon looked me up and down, then narrowed her eyes. "I know your type," she said. "My type?" I blurted. "Cease." Twilight screamed from the audience. "Don't listen to her! She's..." Nightmare Moon's eyes flashed and she lit her horn again. A thick wall of purple smoke billowed around us, cutting off all sound. "I know you don't want to be princess," she said. "Not really. All you want is the glory, not the burden." She smiled, showing her pointed teeth. "That petrol has chafed since the day you put it on, hasn't it?" I bit my lip. I'd heard the stories, though I never believed them. I knew what she was. I knew what she'd done. I knew I had to stop her somehow, and yet, for all that, slowly, I nodded. Her smile widened a little. "Then I can take your burden," she said. "Set you free. Just..." She held out a hoof. "Give me the Sunstone." I looked down at her hoof, then back up at her. "Come now," she said, her voice hardening at the edges. "Give it to me, and no one will ever bother you again." I looked up into her eyes and saw something there. "Give it to me, you stupid filly!" she spat. I clutched at the petrol. "Never!" I cried. She snarled and lit her horn, and suddenly I was lifted off my hooves and hung there, 3 feet in the air, dangling from the petrol. Nightmare Moon reached behind my neck and yanked out the pin, and I dropped to the floor in a heap, coughing. The whirling purple clouds vanished, and Nightmare Moon strode from the hall amid the cries of the town's ponies. Petrol held triumphantly in her magic. Twilight pushed her way through the crowd, leapt onto the platform, and helped me climb to my hooves. I leaned heavily on her and took deep, gasping breaths. Already I could see our new friends pushing against their screaming crowd, fighting their way towards us. Beside me, Twilight gulped. "What do we do now?" she asked. I snarled. "We go after her," I spat. Twilight looked up at me and paled.
A collector's dream, these books are, with high-quality art prints across the hardcover as well as in the pages. The Ministry of Image makes sure each book is crafted with care. They feature some of your favorite stories from collections such as Tales of the Sun and Tales of the Moon, to stories spanning several books such as the ever-popular Fallout Equestria, Project Horizons. Based out of Russia, they ship internationally along with a tracking number to make sure your books arrive on time and undamaged. The Ministry of Image is a passionate group of fans of the show that work closely with the fandom in order to create something special. Please visit their website, ministryofimage.net, and pick up your books today. As for the giveaway, this very book that I have been reading out of will be signed and given away once the book is completed. To enter, please join the Discord in the description and stay tuned to the info and announcements channel where the giveaway will be announced.